What's up YouTube? Welcome to CodAffection. Today we are going to implement complete React.js CRUD operations with ASP.NET Core Web API and SQL Server. I would like to summarize this video into following lines. ASP.NET Core API will implement CRUD operations using SQL Server and Entity Framework. React form designed with Material UI using React hook components. How to consume ASP.NET Core API from React.js. Redux will be used for the React state management. Finally, we also discuss how to implement real-time form validation inside the app. So I'm sure you will find this tutorial helpful for your upcoming React or .NET Core projects. So please watch till the end of this tutorial. So I want to create the project inside this folder. First of all, we will have the ASP.NET Core Web API and then the React.js application. So here is my Visual Studio 2019. So let's create a new project. Then we have to select ASP.NET Core Web Application. In my case, it is there in top of the list. You can easily find this template if you select these filter options C# and Web. Or you can directly search that inside this search box here. Make sure that we have selected the web application with C# language. Then click on Next. I will name this project as Web API. And here we have to provide the corresponding folder path. So let me copy that from here and I will paste that here. Click on Create. Make sure that .NET Core and ASP.NET Core 3.0 is selected from these two drop downs. Beneath that, select API, then uncheck this HTTP configuration here. Click on Create. So here we have the fresh boilerplate Web API project. I hope you know the basics of ASP.NET Core. We have discussed them in previous tutorials. If you are new to .NET Core, don't worry, we can discuss them in brief. In order to demonstrate the CRUD operations, we are going to build a blood donation project. Inside that, we will feed details of donation candidate. So first of all, let's create model class for the app. So right click on the project, then create a new folder. Models. Inside this project, we will be using Entity Framework Core DB first approach. So first of all, we have to create a DB context class. I will name it as donation DB context. Normally, using this DB context class, we will be passing details like what type of database we are going to use, whether it is SQL Server, MySQL, etc. And also we will pass the connection details for the particular DB, and also we will pass the tables that we want to see in our database. Since we are going to use Entity Framework Core, we have to install corresponding NuGet packages into this project. So right click on this project, then manage NuGet packages. Then inside this browse tab, search for Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Select the package. From this version, we have to select the same version as that of the ASP.NET Core. As you can see inside these dependencies here, frameworks, select the .NET Core. In my case, version is ASP.NET Core 3. So select the same version from this drop down here. Then click on Install, click on OK, accept the license. After that, you have to check this package Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. In previous versions of Entity Framework, when we install the parent package, this will be installed. In latest versions, you have to do that separately. So select the same version, click on Install. And then we have one more package, which is Entity Framework Core Tools. Select the same version, click on Install. After installing all of these three packages, back to the DB context, we have to create a new model class for donation candidate. So let's do that. Donation candidate, in short, D candidate. Here we have to provide properties corresponding to each column that we want in our table. So first of all, we will have the primary key, ID, then full name of candidate, mobile, email, age, blood group, address. Now we have to specify this ID as the primary key for the table, so that we can do here like this key. Now let's add the corresponding namespace. For that, you can use the shortcut, hold Control, then press period or dot symbol on your keyboard and select this namespace. Now we have to provide the corresponding SQL data type for these columns. So we can do this column. Let's add the corresponding namespace using same shortcut. Type name is equal to nvarchar 100. Let me copy this and I will paste that for remaining properties. We don't have to do that for integer. And let's update the number of characters accordingly. So here we have done with donation candidate model. Now back to the DB context. We have to inherit this class from DB context class. So DB context. Let's add the corresponding namespace and let's create the constructor here using the snippet CTOR. For this constructor, we have a single parameter DB context options of the type donation context itself as options, and we have to pass the same to the base class constructor options. We can discuss what we meant by this parameter constructor here. Before that, we have to add a property of this class dCandidate here, then only corresponding table will be created. So let's create a property of the type dbSet for that model class dCandidate. Corresponding property name will be dCandidates. Through this constructor parameter, we have to pass informations like which database we are going to use and corresponding database connection details that we will be passing from this startup class here through dependency injection. Okay, inside this startup class you can see this function configuration services, where add controls function is already called from this services, which is of the type iServices collection. We have to call another function for DB context injection. So we will call the function add DB context of the type donation DB context. Let's add the corresponding namespace. Now inside this function we have to pass the values for this constructor parameter options here, so that we can do like this. We have a lambda expression with options. From that we can call use SQL server. We call this function since we are going to use SQL server inside this project. Now let's add the corresponding namespace. Inside this use SQL server function, we have to pass corresponding DB connection details. So first of all, we will save the connection details inside this JSON file app settings. Connection strings is equal to an object. Inside the object, we can have any number of connections. Inside this application, I will name this connection dev connection. You can have separate connections for production and development. Now let's specify the connection string here. So we will start with server. Here we have to provide the corresponding server instance, local /SQL Express, and then we have to provide the database name that we want to create, which is not yet created. It will be created while we migrating the database. Donation DB. In order to connect this DB, we are going to use Windows authentication mode. So we can set this trusted connection as true. In order to execute multiple queries in a single batch, we can set this multiple active result sets as true. Now let's mention that inside this function call here. In order to access the configuration details that we have saved inside this file, we can make use of this property configurations. So we can do this configuration dot get connection string can be called. Inside that we have to provide the corresponding connection name, which is dev connection. So let me copy that and I will paste that here. So here we have made a dependency injection for DB context class. We can discuss how this dependency injection works once we create a controller. We have done everything for our database, so let's do the migration. Through migration, we are going to convert the models to corresponding SQL Server entities or tables. So first of all, let's build this project. After successful build, select the project, go to tools, then NuGet package manager console. First of all, we have to execute this command add migration. The name for the migration, it would be something initial create. As a result of the command execution, here we have a new folder, migrations. In order to create database and corresponding table, we have to execute one more command, update database. Hit enter. We have successfully completed with migration. Now let's check the DB whether this table is created or not. So here is my management studio. Let's expand this databases node. So here we have the new DB with name donation DB, which is the exact database name that we have mentioned inside this connection details, which we have not created manually. It is automatically created in background while executing the migration. Inside this donation DB, let's check whether we have the table D candidates. So let's check the design. First of all, we have the primary key ID. Inside the column properties, you can see that it is specified as identity specification here. So we don't have to insert values into this ID column. It is managed by SQL Server itself. It will start from 1 and incremented by 1 upon new record insertion. Rest of the columns are created as we have mentioned in our model class. Now back to Visual Studio. In order to implement CRUD operations, we have to have the web methods get, post, put and delete. For that, we have to create a controller. So right click on controllers folder, add controller, API controller with actions using entity framework. I will select the model class as D candidate. Context will be donation DB context. Controller name will be D candidate controller. As a result of scaffolding mechanism, here we have the controller with required web methods. Apart from that, we can see the controller constructor with DB context as a parameter. We need this DB context instance in order to do any operations inside the database. Through this constructor parameter, we will receive that and we will assign that to this private property here. Now from where we get this instant DB context? It comes from dependency injection as we have mentioned inside the startup class here. And that instance will be passed to the controller, which has a constructor parameter of the type DB context. So this is how we can benefit from ASP.NET Core dependency injection. We don't have to create the context on every controller. If this dependency injection is not there, we have to create the instance on each controller separately. So that's how the dependency injection works. Now back to the web API methods. First of all, we have the get web method here. Corresponding URL will be something like this, API/D candidate. It will return all of the records from our table. And with this get request here, we will return a specific record with given ID here. And here we have the put web method. It will update an existing record. First of all, inside this web method, it actually compares whether the ID inside this ID parameter and the ID inside this object are same or not. In this project, we are not passing the ID through this D candidate parameter. We will pass that to ID only. So I will remove this if statement from here. Then instead, I have to update the D candidate ID from ID parameter. And then for updating an existing record, corresponding record state will be set as modified, and then just call this save changes function. Inside this if clause, using this function dCandidate exists, it will check whether the record with given ID exists or not. After that, we have the post request, which is used to create a new record. We will add the new record into the DB set that we have created inside the DB context, and then we will just call the save changes function. And finally, this web method will return newly inserted object with inserted ID. Okay, and finally here we have the delete web method. Now let's look how this web API works. So first of all, let me run this application here. So corresponding application is started from this port number here. Currently it is showing response from a default controller weather forecast. In order to access this newly created controller dCandidate, we have to use this URL here. It will return all of the records inside the table. API/dCandidate. Currently you can see an empty array because we have not yet inserted any record into the table here. Okay, in order to insert a new record, we have to make post requests. We can only make get requests from browser URLs like this. In order to make post requests, we have to use applications like Postman. So let me open this application Postman here. First of all, let's make a post request. Corresponding URL is same. So I will just copy this URL from here and I will paste that here. Now inside this body tab here, we have to pass a JSON object containing details of new candidate. In order to pass JSON object, first of all, we have to select this option raw, and from this drop down here, select JSON. Now let's pass the JSON object. First of all, we have full name. Make sure that these properties are exactly typed as we have mentioned inside the model here. So first of all, we have full name. So here we have an object corresponds to a donation candidate. Make sure that we are passing an integer to age column here. Okay. Also make sure that we have selected post from this drop down. Now let's make the request. Boom. So you can see the status 201 created, means post request went successfully. As a result of that, newly created object is returned with corresponding ID. You can see the same if you execute this select star statement again. That's it. Same can be seen inside this get request if you refresh this. Finally, let me show you how to make pull request for updating this record. For that, let me duplicate this. We have to make a put request for updating existing record. Corresponding URL will be something like this. We have to append the corresponding ID at the end. So we can do this /1. Inside the body, we have to pass the candidate object with updated details. So let me update the address from Florida to Texas. Blood group will be updated to O negative. Now let's make the request. That's it. It returns 204 no content, means update went successfully. That you can see from this web method, we are not returning anything after the operation. Let's check whether the record is updated successfully or not. That's it. Same can be seen inside this also. So that's all about the ASP.NET Core Web API. We have implemented CRUD operations. Now let's make a React.js application in order to consume this Web API. Now let's create the app inside the same folder where we have our ASP.NET Core Web API. First of all, we have to open command prompt from this same folder. So you can use this shortcut. Just type cmd inside the folder path, hit enter. So here we have open command prompt from the same folder directory. In order to create a React app, you can use this command npx. In order to create a React app, we will be using the package called create react app. Create react app. And then name of the app, I will name this app as React app itself. Hit enter. Based on your internet speed, it will take some time to complete this process, so please be patient. After a few minutes later, we have completed the app creation here. As a result of that, you can see the new folder React app. Now let's navigate inside that folder using cd command. Now we have to open the folder inside VS Code editor. For that, you can do this code space period, hit enter. So here we have the fresh React app. Before moving forward, let's open this application inside the browser. So let me open the terminal, then run this command npm start to start the server. So this is how the fresh React app looks like. And here it says we have to update the component app for further modifications. So back to the VS Code editor. Inside the src folder, you can see app.js, which is the primary component for the app, and this HTML is responsible for the default view of the application here. First of all, I want to show the structure of the app that we want to build. So let me create a new txt file here. I will name it as refworks. So first of all, we have the app structure. I have already prepared that. So let me paste that here. So here we have the src folder. Inside that you can see this primary JavaScript file index.js, and here we have the default component app. You can add global CSS rules inside this index.css. So first of all, inside this index.css, I want to import this Google font Roboto. So back to the browser, search for Google font Roboto. Click on this, select this font. At the bottom you can see this dialog. Then inside this import tab we have the import statement. So let me copy this. Then I will paste that at the top here. First of all, I want to retrieve the record that we have inserted into the SQL Server through ASP.NET Core. As you know, inside this application we are going to use Redux for state management. So let's look how Redux works. Okay, for Redux we have to install 3 packages. First of all, we have Redux. Then in order to connect with Redux and React application, we have to install this package React Redux. And finally, we have to install one more package called Redux Thunk. We can discuss that why we need this package. In previous tutorial, we have discussed basics of Redux with React app. I have given the link in video description and inside the first comment. Basically, it has 3 elements. First of all, action, then reducer, then store. Inside this store, we will store all of the records in a state. And inside this action, we will describe what type of actions we have. It would be create, update, delete, etc. It will be an object containing the operation like create, update, delete. Along with that, we will have a data which is to be deleted or updated. Then this action object will be passed to the reducer. Inside reducer, we will modify the data inside the store here. So it would be something like this. From component, in order to pass this action object to this reducer, we have to call this Redux function dispatch. Inside that, we have to pass the action. Then it will reach up to the reducer. Based on the operation we have to do, reducer will update the data inside the store. Corresponding updates can be reflected inside the component. We can discuss them while developing this application. Don't worry if you are confused now. So let's install these 3 packages. So let me open one more terminal here. npm I for install, S for save, Redux, React, Redux, then Redux Thunk. Hit enter. Previously we have imported the Google font here, so we have to update this font family also. I will keep only Roboto here. Let's remove rest of the font family here. So here we have completed with the installation. Now we have to create Redux actions, reducer and store. First of all, we will create the store inside this actions folder, where we have to define how do we want to save the data inside the Redux store. So first of all, let's create the folder actions. Inside that, we can create the store, store.js. To create the store, we will be using create store function from Redux. First of all, let's import create store from Redux. Create store. Along with Redux, we have also installed Redux Thunk. I will explain why we need Redux Thunk later. For now, let's import that here. From Redux Thunk, we will import Thunk here. Now let's create this store. Store is equal to, we can call the function create store. As a first parameter, we have to pass reducers here. For now, I will just pass an empty object. We can pass reducer once we create them. As a second parameter, we have to pass the middlewares. For now, I will just add this thunk as a middleware. For that, we have to import few functions, apply middleware and compose. Compose, inside that, apply middleware function can be called. Into that, we will pass the thunk. So here we have created the store. We have to update that later once we create reducer, and here we have exported the store. Now in order to access this store, we have to add that inside the app component here. Let me remove all of this default HTML from here. First of all, we will import the store that we have just created. Inside actions, we have store, import store. In order to apply this store, we have to import provider component from React Redux. Import from React Redux. Let's import provider. Now we can mention that here provider, and here we can pass the store. Store is equal to the store that we have imported. Now we will include the application components inside this provider component so that all of those components can access this store. Now inside this provider we will be showing rest of the components. As per the app structure, we have to create two components, dCandidate form and dCandidates. So let's create that here. First of all, we need a folder called components. First of all, we have dCandidates, and then we have dCandidate form. For previous tutorials, we have been using class-based components, but from now onwards we will be using React hooks to create React components. We can have all of the features from class-based components inside React hook also. We can save data like we used to do in class-based component stage. In React hooks, we don't have lifecycle events, so we don't have to remember all of them. We have a simple alternative for that with use effects. Don't worry, if you are new with React hooks, you can learn them while developing this application. I strongly recommend that over class-based components. Nowadays, everyone replaces class-based components with React hooks. For React development, I have installed this extension for React snippets. For example, if you want to create a functional component, you can use this snippet RFC. If you want to create a React class-based component, you can use this RCC. Now let's create a functional component without state, so SFC. I will name this component as dCandidates. For this component, we have a single parameter props. For now, from this function, we will return a simple div from dCandidates. In same way, let's create this form component, SFC, dCandidate form props. Here I will just return a div from dCandidate form. Now let's add this dCandidates inside the app component here, dCandidate. From this auto suggestion, just click on this so that it will automatically add the import statement here. Now inside this dCandidates component, we can access this too. We can do that later. For now, just complete all of the Redux elements that we have discussed here. We have created this store. Now let's create the actions. Okay, so inside this actions folder, we have to create this file dCandidate.js. dCandidate.js. First of all, I will show you what we have been doing before Redux Thunk. Basically, actions were meant to define what type of operations that we want to do. So this is what we have been doing: export, constant, create, and we can have a parameter like this. From this, we will return an object type. We have to define the operation. Here it would be create, and inside the payload key, we will pass the data. Previously, we have been defining actions like this, and from component we will be calling the dispatch function. Inside that, we have to call this create function, create, and inside this we will be passing an object containing details of the candidate. Inside reducer, based on the action or the type of operation create, this data will be inserted to the store. Now for the actual insert operation, we have to post this data into the API. In this case, we have to do that API calls inside reducer. Even though we are calling this an action, we are not doing any action here. We are just returning an object with operation and the required data. In these Redux actions, asynchronous API calls were not allowed. In order to make such asynchronous API calls, we have installed this middleware package Redux Thunk. If we have this Thunk middleware, we can make asynchronous functions inside the actions. In that case, reducer will be a pure function to just update the store. That is what we want. So let's look how we can do this in a better way. First of all, I will create an object like this, export constant action types. This is a constant object just to define what type of operation we have inside the app. Create is equal to create, and then we have update. So let me add that like this way. Then I will use VS Code multiple cursor feature. We can have multiple cursor to enter same thing. So hold Alt, then click here, update, and then we have delete, fetch all. First of all, let me show you how you can retrieve this struct code that we have inserted. For that, we can define a function like this, export constant fetch all. You can call this function as an action creator or a Redux thunk wrapper function. For fetch function, we don't have any parameters, so it will be empty. Inside this function, we will just return another function like this, return. And for this function, we have a single parameter dispatch, and inside this function we will do the actual operations. Okay, so we will have the thunk function or action creator. Inside that, we will return another function with a parameter dispatch. So this is the actual structure of the function. In most of the case, you will see a simple syntax like this. You don't need this curly brace. We can have the simplified version like this. Okay, this is a function parameter for the wrapper, and this is the inner function parameter dispatch. First of all, inside this function, we have to make a get API request, okay, to retrieve all of the records, and then we will call the dispatch function. The implementation of this function dispatch is there inside Redux. We don't have to worry that. First of all, we will have the type action types fetch all. Pass the data here as payload is equal to an array. We have to retrieve that from our ASP.NET Core Web API. We will do that in a bit. Before that, let me show you how you can implement the reducer. As per this structure, we will create reducer inside this reducers folder. So let's do that here. Reducers. Inside that, we can have this the candidate. First of all, I will import all of the action types that we have created here. So import from actions. Then we have this file dcandidate. From that, we have to import action types. Now let's create the function for reducer. Actually, reducer is a function. So export constant dcandidate is equal to, basically for this function we have two parameter, state and then action. The action object that we have passed here, this object will be there inside this actions parameter. Now inside this state parameter, we have to tell what information we have to store inside Redux. For this reducer, we need an array to store all of the donation candidate details. So I will do this. Initial state is equal to an object. Inside that, we have a single array. Initially it would be an empty array. Now we can pass this initial state here. Now let's complete this function. As we have discussed inside reducer, based on the operation that we have passed, reducer should update the values inside the store here. So we can complete the implementation using switch statement, and the key for this switch will be the operation. So action dot type can be passed here. For now, I will just define what we have to do for fetch operation. So fetch all. Reducer will return an object like this. Inside fetch operation, we have all the records from the table. So we have to replace that here. List is equal to an array. Inside that, we have to pass the data that we have passed from the action. So action dot payload. For fetch all operation, we don't have to worry about existing records inside this list. We will just replace them entirely with the data that we have passed from the action. Normally we have to do this state. If there is any other information stored inside the store, we have to do this here. Okay, we don't need this break statement. since we have the return statement here. So this is what we can do inside reducer for fetch all operation. Object retrieved from this case will be updated into the Redux store. We have to deal with rest of the operations also. We can do that later. Inside default, we can just return the state as it is, return state. So we have defined the reducer for fetch all operation. Now back to the action, and let's make the API request to retrieve all of the records from ASP.NET Core. As per the structure, I will create a new file, api.js, where we handle all of the HTTP requests. So it would be really handy to handle the server part, since we have all of the connections inside this file, api.js. If there is any update in URL, we just have to update this file, api.js. So let's create that here, api.js. In order to make HTTP requests, we will use the package Axios. So let's install that here, npm i4 install, then save that, Axios. So here we have installed the package. Now let's import that here, Axios, and here we have to import Axios. Here we have to make a GET request to this URL here. So first of all, I will define a variable base URL is equal to, I will just copy this base part of the URL. Rest of the part will be different for different controllers. So let me paste that here. Then I will export an object like this, export default. This is an object. Inside this, we can have different functions for different controllers inside the ASP.NET Core. For dCandidate, I will have this function dCandidate. For this function, we have a single parameter URL, and from this function, we will return an object like this, return. Inside the object, we will have different functions for different type of web methods. So it would be something like this. Fetch all is a function without any parameter, and here we have to make the GET request, axios.get, and here we can pass the URL. Okay, now we have to pass the value for this URL. So I will set that as a default value here. If you have different URL, you can pass that while calling this function. Into this base URL, we have to pass the suffix here, dCandidate. Like this, let's define rest of the common web methods. So you can have something like this, fetch by ID. It will be a function with a single parameter ID. Axios.get function can be called. Inside that, we have to pass the URL, and let's concat the ID here, and then let's make the create request to insert a record. We will have a parameter new record. Inside the function, we can do this. Axios.post function can be called. First parameter will be the URL itself, and the second parameter will be the new record. And let's have a function for update operation. We have two parameters, ID and then updated object, updated record. Axios.put function can be called. URL will be something like this, URL, and we have to concat the ID and the object with updated details, updated record. And finally, here we have the delete operation. We have a single parameter ID. Axios.delete function can be called, and then here we have the URL. Let's concat the ID here. Sorry, I forgot to add the / here. Now let's look how we can make use of this common function. Inside this action, let's make the GET request to fetch all of the records. So first of all, I will just import the API file that we have just created. From API file, we have to import. We will import the file with this name API, and here we can make the GET request like this. API dCandidate function can be called. Since we are not passing the URL, appropriate URL will be consumed. Okay, base URL with the controller URL dCandidate. If this request went successful, that can be handled inside this callback function. Then if there is any error, that can be handled inside this catch function here. Okay, so it would be something like this response. Inside that we can call this dispatch function that we have already done here. So let me remove this. Now let's move this call into this response function. Now instead of the empty URL, we can pass the array that we have retrieved from the .NET Core API. So it would be there inside this response. Return array will be there inside this property data. And inside this catch function, we can have a callback function like this, console.log, and we will pass the error here. So actually we have done with this action creator for fetch or operation. Now let's call this action creator inside the component dCandidates here. Okay, first of all, inside any React component we have to import React. So import from React, we have to import it as React here. Let me save this and back to the app. Expected the reducer to be a function. Sorry, I always make this mistake. We have to mention the reducer that we have created inside this. I always forget this step. Sorry, I misspelled this here. dCandidate. We only have one entity, which is donation candidate, so we only have one reducer. In a normal application we will have more than one reducer, so we have to combine that all, and then we have to pass that inside this store parameter here. So in order to combine that, I will create a new index file as we have mentioned inside this structure, index.js. So here it is. In order to combine reducer, we can import this class, import from Redux, and we have to import this class combine reducers. Now let's import the reducer. We have dCandidate, and let's import that here. Now we can do this export constant reducers. We can call the function combine reducer here. Into that we can just pass an object with all the reducers. We only have one here, so I will pass that here. Now let's pass this combine reducer inside the store here. So first of all, we will import the combine reducer here. So inside the reducers we have index.js. We don't have to mention that here. By default, if you are not passing any file here, it will always look for index.js first. Inside that we have the combined reducer, so reducers. Now let's pass that here. Okay, currently our app look like this. Actually inside dCandidate, sorry, not from dCandidates, and inside this we have from dCandidate form. That's enough. We just want to show what component we are displaying. The action creator and the data that we have set inside this reducer will be there inside the store that we have passed inside the app component. We can directly access this store inside our component. Instead, we'll use the package that we have installed here, React Redux, to act as an intermediate between React and Redux. So we can do this, React Redux. We will import the function connect, and we can call that function here, connect. Okay, and we can pass this component. I hope you understood this syntax here. Connect is a function. It returns another function. As a parameter to that return function, we have passed this component here. For this connect function, I will pass two parameters. First of all, constant map state to props. This is a function with a single parameter state, and it will look like this, return an object. I will do this, dCandidate list is equal to state dot dCandidate dot list. Let me explain how this works. We have stored this list inside the reducer dCandidate here. We have passed this list into the store here. So the list will be stored inside the Redux store inside an object with name dCandidate. So that is why we are accessing that list from this dCandidate here. This is the name of the reducer where we have created this list. Okay, so we have mapped this list into this key property dCandidate list. I will tell you how it works. For now, you can simplify this syntax here. If you are just returning an object inside a function, you can simplify that like this. You can remove this return statement. Instead, we can use the brackets. We just simplify this syntax. It is a function just to return an object like this. Now we have to pass this as a first parameter to this connect function here. So map to state props. Now in order to access this list from store, we can make use of the key property here from this props parameter like this, props dot dCandidate list. Okay, like that we have to map this action creators also. So first of all, let's add the import statement. Import from actions folder, we have the file dCandidate. From that, we will import all of the functions that we have as actions. Now let's define a function to map those action creators as map action to props. We can just pass an object like this. For now, we only have one action creator. I will map that into this key here, fetch all dCandidates. From actions, we will map this function fetch all. Now let's call this fetch all action creator. Inside this application, this component dCandidates is the parent component, okay? Parent component, and we will display the form component inside the parent child component. When we load this component, we have to fetch all of the records that we have inserted into the table. If we were using a class-based component, we will do that inside component did update lifecycle. But in case of React hooks, we don't have any such life cycles. In React hooks, there are two main functions. Let's import that here. Use state and use effect. Let me explain this for newcomers. Like we have in class-based components, we can store data using use state functions here. Okay, so it would be something like this, constant. And we can have a tuple, a property x, and we will have a function called setX, and we will assign that with this function called use state. Inside this function, we can pass the initial value for this x. You can store data inside this variable x, and its initial value is passed as 0. In order to update this value x, you can call this function setX. For example, if you want to set the value of x to 5, you can do this. Instead of lifecycle events from class-based components, we can use this use fx. Suppose if you want to do something when value of this x changes, so you can do that. Here we will have a callback function here. And this callback function will be called whenever the value of x is changed. When value of x changes, you can do something inside this callback function. If you want an exact alternative to component did mount, you can do this. Pass an empty array here, and we can do whatever we want when component is completely loaded. So this is an alternative to component did mount. For now, we don't need this x state, so let me comment this. So when component is fully loaded, we can call this function fetch all. So I will do that like this, props dot fetch all candidates. We forgot to pass this mapping as a second parameter here. First parameter is an object to map state properties to props, and second one is to map action creators. Now back to the application. Default dCandidate then is not a function. It looks like the API function call here. We have the function fetch all, and we have called that here. Sorry, we have not yet called. So fetch all. Okay, save, back to the app. Now we have a valid error. You will see the same error when you try to access an API. Meaning this ASP.NET Core will block other resources from accessing its resources, which is hosted in a different domain or a different port number. So we have to enable CORS, which you can see here, cross origin resource sharing. So let's add the privilege to make a request from this port number 3000 inside our ASP.NET Core application here. First of all, let me stop this execution. In order to enable CORS, we have to install an NuGet package. So right click on this project, manage NuGet packages, then search for Microsoft ASP.NET Core.CORS. It has a different version history that of ASP.NET Core. So you can select the latest version, click on install. You don't have to check for the same version as that of ASP.NET Core like we have done for Entity Framework Core packages. After successful installation, we have to configure that inside this startup class here. First of all, we will add this CORS package into the services here. So services.add_CORS can be called. Now let's configure that inside this configure function. The line where you configure this CORS is very important. If you do that at the end of this function here, it may not work as expected. So better, I will do that here. app.use CORS function can be called here. Inside that we can have this lambda expression options dot with origins. Here we have to pass the React app URL. So let me copy that from here and let's paste that here. Don't forget to remove the / at the end. And then we have to call this function allow any header, allow any method. So this will allow any web method like get, put, post, delete, etc. And we can have any attribute inside the request header. Let's run this application again. After starting this API, back to the React app, then reload this page so we don't have any HTTP error. Hence, this fetch operation should be when drawn. This fetch operation should be executed. So let me log this response that we have retrieved from the request console.log response. So currently you can see this response from our ASP.NET Core. Inside this data property, we will have the data that we have returned from this API here. Okay, we have just returned that list, but inside this request response, you can see request related data added to this response. Inside this callback function, we have called this dispatch function with corresponding action. Inside this object, we have passed the data that we have retrieved from the API. This will reach up to this reducer. Inside this case here, data will be stored into this candidate list. If you want to see the data inside your web browser, you can install Chrome extension Redux dev tool. I have already installed this extension. After installing this extension, we have to update the React app middleware, which is mentioned inside the website. Here you can see the website link in additional information. So here we are inside the corresponding GitHub repository. Now let's copy this line from here. Now let's add that inside the store middleware here. Okay, that's it. Now back to the app, reload this page. Now if you click on this extension icon here, you can see the data that we have saved. So here we have the list array inside this D candidate. So this is how we can see data inside Redux store. So for now, I will comment this line. Before continuing with this project development, I would like to thank for your PayPal donations for my previous works. It really motivates me to make more helpful and quality tutorials like this. I have given the donation link in video description and inside the first comment of the video. Now back to the topic. Let's look how we can display the data that we have retrieved from ASP.NET Core inside this component D candidates. As a front-end UI framework for this app, we will be using Material UI. So let's install corresponding npm packages. npm I for install, S for save, and here is the packages Material UI /core, and we have one more package Material UI icons. Hit enter. We have installed these packages. Now let's add that into this component D candidates. Basically, Material UI contains React components for each element. For example, it has components for input field, button, checkbox, radio button, table, etc. And this package is inspired from Material Design of Google. So first of all, we have to add container component from material UI. It defines how much space we want to use for the app development from device display. So I will add that inside the app component here. We just have to enclose that around this dCandidates component here. So we have to add container from material UI. Now let's add the corresponding import statement, import from material UI core. We have to import container. We can configure this container by passing the attribute like this, max width is equal to. So if you want to take more space, you can use LG and SM for small, XS for extra small. So I will select LG. Now let's enclose the component with the container. Now inside the dCandidates, we can design the rest. First of all, we can have a grid like we used to do in Bootstrap. We have to use the grid component. If you click on this auto suggestion option, corresponding import statement will be added at the top. So here is the corresponding import statement from material UI. So this is like the container for the grid. So we can mention that here as a column for this grid, we can add another grid, and this is for column. So we can specify the item here. Using XS, we can specify the width of this column. Totally we have 12 columns like we used to do in Bootstrap. So I will set 6 for the first column. Like this, we need one more column. So let me copy this and pasting below that. Inside this first grid column, I want to display this form component. So let's add that here, dCandidate form. Now inside the second column, we will have a list of candidates. Back to the app. We forgot to import React inside this form component. Import from React, import React. Inside the first column, form component will be displayed. List of candidates will be displayed inside the second column here. Now I want to add a border for this grid here. For that, we can use another material component. So let's wrap that component around this grid. So select the text, then you can use the shortcut from VS Code, Ctrl+Shift+P, then search for wrap with abbreviation, hit enter, then type paper, press enter. Now let's import the component here, paper. Now you can see a background around the grid. We can customize that later. Now let's display the list of candidates inside the second column here. First of all, we will add table container. Click on this, corresponding import statement will be added at the top. Inside that, we can have table. Then we will have table head. Inside this, we can have table header columns. So first of all, I will add the row, table row. Now let's add the cell corresponding to TH, table cell. Try to hit enter when the component is listed in auto suggestion, so that corresponding import statement will be there at the top. So far we have imported components up to table, table head, table row, table cell. Inside the first cell, we have to show the name of the candidate. So name, I want to show 2 more columns. So let me copy this. This is for mobile, blood group. Let me show these details inside the table body. Table body. Hit enter when you see corresponding element in auto suggestion. Now we have to show table row elements as much as rows that we have inside the table. We can access list of candidates using this key property here, dCandidate list. First of all, let's add a curly brace. We have to execute JavaScript code here. We can access the list like this, props.dCandidate list, and here we will call the map function. Inside that, we have a callback function with 2 parameters, record and index. And here is the corresponding callback function body, return. Inside the brackets, we can add table row. Now let's add the table cell. Inside that, we have to show the full name. So record dot full name. Now let me copy this and pasting below that, mobile, blood group. Now when we render through iterations like this, we have to add a key property to the element. So key is equal to index. So this key property will be different for each row. Now let me save this and back to the app here. Boom, that's it. Here we have the list of candidates. Now let me show you how you can customize material components using CSS. For this grid here, I want to add some margin and some padding. So let's do that here. For now, I will be using this method, using this function with styles. First of all, I will define an object like this, styles, with a single parameter theme. Through this theme parameter, we can access default configurations of the material UI. From this function, we just need to return an object, so we can do this. So I will add a class called paper. Inside that, we can add the custom CSS. First of all, I will add the margin. You can directly specify the margin with px or rem like we used to do in usual style sheets, but I will be using this parameter theme. So we can do this. Theme dot spacing function can be called. Into that function, I will pass 2. By default, theme spacing 1 is 8 pixels. So here we will have 2 into 8, 16 pixels. Okay, now let's add the same padding. Padding is equal to theme dot spacing 2. Now we are going to access this class paper through props. For that, we have to call this function with styles like we have done here for connect function. So I will call this with styles. As a parameter to this function, I will pass the styles that we have created, and then we will pass this D candidates. So after adding this with styles function here, there will be a property added to this props like props dot classes. In order to access this, we will do this constant, then classes, then rest of the properties will be the in props. So this is how we separate the classes from props. I'm going to do that directly inside this parameter list here. So classes, rest of them will be there in props itself. So this is how we retrieve the class. Now let's specify this class paper into this element here. Class name is equal to classes dot paper. That's it. We have added margin and padding. To highlight this grid here, I want to add more shading to this control. So I will do this. We just need to set this elevation property 3. Save. Now you can see more shading here. Now let me show you how you can override classes inside Material UI. For example, if you want to highlight this table header here, let's check corresponding Material UI class here. So I click on it, inspect. So this class MUI table cell head will only be applied to table head cells. So in order to highlight them, we can override this class. For that, we can do this along with this class here. We will add another class root. This root property is just to override existing styles. First of all, we will have the and symbol in order to append rest of the styles from Material UI. We have to add that as a prefix to the style. Then we have to provide the corresponding class. So let me copy that from here. This is not a Material UI tutorial, even though you may have to know these things. Here I will just increase the font size. Normally in CSS we will do this font size. This is not allowed with JavaScript syntax. So you have to replace the letter after hyphen with corresponding capital letter. I will set it as something 1.25 rem. Okay. Now we have to apply this root class into a parent element for this table cell here. So I will just apply that here. Class name is equal to classes dot save back to the app. That's it. Now I want to do one more thing. When we hover on these rows here, we have to highlight the corresponding row. For that, you can just add this property hover here. Now when we hover on these rows, it will be highlighted. Now let's look how to design a React form using Material UI. We will do that inside this component dCandidate form. You can see corresponding documentation here. So we will be using text field component for input fields, and we will be showing these types of input fields. So inside this component, first of all, I want to have a form. So here is the form. In order to prevent auto suggestion from previously posted data, I want to set this property autocomplete as off. And in order to disable default validation from HTML, I will add this attribute noValidate. Inside this form, we will be showing controls in a 2-grid column. So we can add the grid here. Grid, this will be the container. Inside that, we can have the column. Grid item 6+6 will be used here. Now let's add a text field for full name. So text field, for any input control, we have to provide the name. So name is equal to full name. To have this kind of input fields, we have to set this property variant as outlined. The label, full name. Okay, that's it. So here we have the input control for full name. You can make entries inside this input control. At the same time, we have to feed these input control values inside the component state. So let's do that. For that, we will be using the React hooks method here. First of all, we have to import corresponding class, use state. Now I will just define the state here. Constant values will be an object. It will contain all of the properties to save donation candidate details. Along with that, we will have the function set values to update the object, and we can call the function use state. Into this function, we have to pass the initial value. So I will define an object containing initial values of the fields. So initial field values equal to an object. First of all, we have full name. We have to provide the same key as that of this name property for corresponding text field here. So it will be an empty string, and then we have mobile, email, age, blood group, and finally address. Now we can pass this object into this useState function here. So this is how we declare state properties. Now in order to show the value from this full name property inside this control here, we have to set this property value is equal to values dot full name. Now while we entering values inside this input control, we have to change corresponding property value inside this values object or state. So we have to implement onChange event here. OnChange is equal to, we will handle that inside a function handle input change. Now let's define the function here. For this function, we have a single parameter event, which is the default parameter to any HTML events. We have to set the value of this full name property. So set values function can be called. This handle input change function can be called from any input control inside the form. Since we have set corresponding property as the name of this control, we can make use of that here. First of all, we will have the name of the control and then value. We can retrieve these values from the default parameter like this. e.target will be the input control. Okay, from that we will return name of that control and value inside the control. Now we can set the value here. Name is equal to value. Rest of the properties should be there as it is. So we have to do this values. That's it. Now let's add remaining controls. So I will just copy this and pasting here 3 times. Inside the first column, we will have 3 controls. Now let's edit these properties accordingly. This is for email. label will be email. Here we want to show a drop down for blood group. For now I will just pass a div showing blood group. Later we will replace that with a drop down. Now let me copy this text field. Let's paste that inside the second column here. We have to add 3 more controls. Here we want to show controls for mobile, age and address. So let me update the attributes accordingly. Let me save this back to the app. That's it. Here we have to add some margin between these controls that we can do in a bit. Before that, I want to show you a cool trick with React hooks. Inside this component, form component, we have this function for input, handle input change. We can reuse these common functions in various components. In order to do that, we will move all of the common functions into another component using React hooks. For that, we will create another component with React hooks containing these common logics that we have already mentioned inside the app structure. We will create such a component with common form operations. Let's create that. Use form. Let me use the snippet sfc. I will name this component as use form. For this component, we will have a single parameter, initial field values. Okay, in any React component, we have to import React from React. So let's import that here. From React, let's import React. Since this is a React hook component, we may have to use these functions, use state and use effect. In any form component, we may need this state property values. So constant values and then set values function, and we will initialize that with use state function. As a parameter, we have to pass the values from this parameter initial field values. Now let me cut this function from here and I will paste that here. And finally, we will return such reusable elements. First of all, we have values, set values, and then this handle function, handle input. Now let's import this inside the form component. From this component use form, we will import it as use form here. And then inside this form component, we can call this function use form. So this is how we do it. Constant, we will assign that by calling the function use form here. Into that, we will pass the initial values that we have specified here. And this use function returns all of the reusable codes. And we can retrieve that inside this object. First of all, we have values, then set values, and then handle input change. So like this, we can keep common codes inside this use form. So this is how we can reuse common logic in React hooks. Now let's look how to add a margin for these input controls. You can see the same inside this documentation here. It is done inside this styles object by overriding this class here. So let's do that inside the component. First of all, we have to import the with styles. Now let's define the function styles, single parameter theme. From this function, we just need to return an object, so we can do this. Now let me copy this CSS from here. Instead of width, I will set min width as 230 or something. So here we have defined the custom style. Now let's map that into props of this component. So we can call this function with styles. As a first parameter, we will pass the styles function and we can pass the component like this. Sorry, we have to enclose this style inside this key root. Now we have to apply this root class for a root component to that input fields. So I will do that for this form component itself. Class name is equal to classes. Sorry, first of all, we have to mention that inside this parameter list classes, and rest of them will be props. So classes dot root save. Back to the app. That's it. Now let's replace this blood group div with a select control. So here you can see the select control. So we want to show a select control like this. So back to the component. In order to show a select drop down, we can do this. First of all, we will have this form control from material UI, and we will set this variant attribute outlined, and inside this control we will have this input label. This will be a label for this control, so I will set it as blood group. Below that we can have the select control, which is also from material UI, not the HTML select. Name is equal to blood group, which is what we have provided inside the state. So blood group. Then I will set the value here. Value is equal to values dot blood group, and then we have to provide the on change event. So I will copy that from here. Now inside the select control, for each options we can add this menu item. First of all, we will have the default option. Value will be empty string. Inside that I will show this select blood group. Now let's add menu item for each blood group. Menu item. For now I will set the value as something AB positive. Item text will be positive. In total we have 8 blood groups. So let me copy paste this. Now let me edit these menu items according to the blood groups. So here we have the 8 blood groups with default option. Save back to the app. So here we have the blood group. We have to add CSS rules like we have done for input controls here. So first of all, I will define a class form control is equal to. I will be using the same style here. So let me copy this. Now let's apply this form control class here. Class name classes dot form control. Now we have properly aligned this with rest of the controls. Now we have another problem. We are trying to show a select drop down like this. Here it shows properly. So let's check that inside the code how it manages that problem. Here you can see the reference to the label that we have here. So a reference is set to this input label, and then inside this select control you can see this property label width, which is set dynamically from this property. You can see the proper code here. I will just copy this code from here and I will paste that inside our component. So I will just paste that here. This is just for the material UI select drop down. UI select. Don't feel bad if you think this is an extra work. You can avoid this extra work if you move these codes into use forms here, and then you can import that here. For now I will just keep this here. So we have a reference input label, and then we have to set that to this control input label ref input label, and we have to set the label width for this. Label width is equal to label width. Initially we have set the reference to this label control, and it is applied to that label input label. And here we have the label width state property with corresponding set function. Initially its value is 0, and when this component is completely loaded, it will set the width of this label width same as that of this input label offset width. Let me save this. Back to the app. Now let me try to select an option. It works as expected. Yeah, that's it. So far we have a neat form here. Now let's try to submit this form. For that we have to add submit button and reset button for the form. I will do that inside the second grid column here. I will show those two buttons inside a div so that we can see them in a single line. Button variant is equal to contained Then we can set color from material UI like this, primary. It is similar to blue. Inside this button, we will have the text submit. Now let me copy this button. So this is for the reset operation. For this submit button, we have to set the type as submit. For reset button, we will use the default color. Now we have to add some margin for these buttons. Small margin, in short SM margin. We will apply the same margin. So let me copy this. Now we can apply that for these two buttons. Class name, classes, SM margin. So here we have applied the margin. Now let's implement the submit event. On submit, we will handle that inside a function, handle submit. Now let's define the function here, handle submit, a function with single parameter, default event parameter. First of all, we have to prevent the default behavior of HTML forms. So prevent default function can be called. Now let me try to log the data from the form. So console.log. Inside that we can have the values. Let me try to submit this form. So that's it. Here we have the state object values. Now let me try to enter something inside these text boxes. Submit. So here we have the proper data from all of these controls. Now let's look how to implement validation inside the form. For that, I'm going to define a function, validate here. For now, this is a function without any parameter. And here is the function body. Basically, this validate function will be different for different components because each of the form will have different fields. But in order to work with this validation, we need a state property that will be common for every component. So I will add that inside these reusable codes here. So it would be errors object, and here is the corresponding set function. We will initialize this with use state function. I will initialize this state with an empty object, and from this we have to export that errors and set errors function. Now let's access that inside this component, errors and set errors. Inside this form, I want to make these controls full name, blood group and mobile as mandatory. So let's look how we can do that. First of all, I will create a temporary object like this, and inside this object we can save the errors. So this is for full name. Here we will check the value of full name. If it is not equal to empty string, then we will set error message as empty string. Otherwise, we will set this field is required. We can even simplify this. Since we are equating with empty string, we just need to do this. If there is a value, error message will be empty. Otherwise, we will show this field is required. We have to do the same for blood group and mobile. So let me copy this and pasting below. Let me update this for mobile and then blood group. Email is not mandatory, but if there is a value, it should be a proper email format. For that, we can do this temp email is equal to, in order to verify proper email format, I will be using regular expression. The pattern should be explained within / like this. It should be an empty string, or there should be one or more character before @ symbol and one or more character after @ symbol, then a period. After that also we need one or more character. So this is a basic regular expression for email. Now we can call the function test. Inside that we can pass the value values.email. If it returns true, meaning email is in proper format. Otherwise we will say this email is not valid. Now let's set the error object using this function set errors. So set errors function can be called. Inside that we can pass an object like this. We will just separate this temporary object. Finally, while submitting this form, we have to check whether this form as a whole is not valid or not. For that, we will check each of the properties inside this temp object whether it is empty string or not. If all of the properties inside this object is empty string, we can say that the form is valid. So in order to check that, we can do this object dot values. Inside that, we have to pass this temporary object. It will return array collection containing all of these values, and from that collection we can call this function every. With this callback function, we can define the condition. We will check whether the values is empty string or not. So if this condition is true for every properties inside this object, it will return true. So we can return that boolean value here. Now let's call this function inside the submit event here. If this validation is successful, we can show an alert here. We can't just call alert like this. Instead, we have to use this window global property. And here we will say validation succeeded. Save, back to the app, submit the form, it returns nothing. Let me populate this full name, it returns nothing. Now let's provide proper values, submit. Boom, here it says validation succeeded. Let's enter random text inside this email, submit the form is not valid. Now let's complete this, submit the form, that's it. Now we have to show error message along with corresponding controls. First of all, we have full name. In order to show an error message inside this control, as per material UI, you have to set this property error as true. Okay, and inside this attribute helper text, we can show the error. We can access that like this, errors dot full name. Since we have set this error property as true, this control will be highlighted every time. Now if you submit this, corresponding error message will be populated inside this property full name. So we have to dynamically handle these two attributes. So first of all, we will have this curly brace, and from this bracket we will return an object, and we will separate that using this operator here. First of all, we will check whether we have any error related to full name. If there is any error, we will return an object, and inside that we will set this error as true, and then we will set the helper text from errors dot full name. So this is how we can conditionally add properties into a component. Now let's do the same for remaining text boxes. So here we have email. Let me update the property name accordingly. Email. For drop down, we have to do something different, and then here we have mobile. In case of select controls, we will add the error attribute here. So I will do this, errors dot blood group. If it is not empty, we will return an object containing error set as true. Now in order to show the exact error message, we have to use form helper text. We will conditionally add that control here, errors dot blood group. If it is not empty, we have to show this component form helper text. Let's import that here. Inside that we can set the error message errors dot blood group. Let me save this. Now let's try to submit this form here. So here we have shown the error messages. All of these three fields are empty. If I try to enter some random text here, then submit, we can see the error for email also. But I'm not comfortable with this validation here, because now let's populate this control. Even though you can see the same error here, it will hide once we submit the form, but we have to do that while entering this form. So I will recommend real-time field validation. We can do that with few modifications inside this function. First of all, I will add a parameter to this function, field values. By default, I will set the value from values state. Now let's update these values to field values. We will be calling the same function for checking form as a whole is valid or not, and we have to use this function to check validity of a given control. So in order to check whether a form is valid as a whole, we will call the function like this. Okay, in this case, this will be assigned to the values property. It will have all of the properties from the form. If you want to check validity of a single control, we will call this function like this. We will have an object, something like full name, for example, Jenny. Now we will do this validation for full name if this field values object contains this key full name. Okay, so we can add this if clause here. We will check whether this key full name is present inside field values. Now let's add the same if statement for remaining validations. This is for mobile, this is for blood group, and finally email. And finally, we only have to check whether this form is valid or not if we call this function without parameter, meaning we have to know whether this form as a whole is valid or not. So here is the condition: if this field values is equal to values, then only we will return the boolean value. So we can call this function inside submit event like this, but in order to make this a real-time validation for each control, we have to do that inside this handle input change function. So first of all, I will pass this function into this use forms here, validate, and inside this use form we can update the parameter list, validate, and we can call this inside this input change function, validate. We have to pass an object containing field name and value. So let's make few changes. Constant field value is equal to an object. Property name can be accessed like this, and we will set the value here. And here we can use the property like this, field value, and we can pass the same to the validate function. Back to the app. Now let me enter some random text here. If you clear this input control, you can see the error related to this full name. If you submit this form, you can see all of the errors inside the form. So this is how we implement React form validation with Material UI. Hi friends, if you have been following this tutorial, you know the effort behind this content. If you don't mind, please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues. If you are new here, please consider subscribing to this channel CodAffection. To get early notification when I upload new videos, tap on the bell icon near to subscribe button. Sorry if I bother you. Now back to the content. Now let's try to insert a new record into ASP.NET Core. So I'm gonna add action creators and reducer for delete, update, and create operations right away. So here we have the create operation. So export constant create. We have two parameters for this function. First of all, we will have the data that we want to insert. As a second parameter, we will have a callback function success. This function will be passed from the component to execute after the insert operation. And then we have the dispatch. Normally, I would like to define a function to format the data that we are going to post or put. In case of this application here, we have set this age as empty string. Before posting this data, instead of empty string, we have to pass 0 for age. So let's define the format function to do such format operations. Format data, we have single parameter data. From this function, we will just return an object. So I will do this data, then age is equal to, we will call this pass in function. Inside that, we will check whether this age property is empty or not. Simply, you just need to do this. If there is a value, we will just pass the data as it is, data.age. Otherwise, we will pass 0. Now inside this function, we can do this, data is equal to format data. Now let's make the post request. For that, we can call this function create from API. API dot decandidate, and let's call this create function. And here is the success callback response. Inside this function, we will call this dispatch function from Redux. Inside that, we have to pass the data and the operation. So type is equal to action types dot create Inside the payload, we have to pass the data that we have just inserted, that we can access from the response.data. And finally, after calling this dispatch, we can call the success callback function here. If there is any error, we will log that error. So let me copy this catch function from here. Then I will paste that here. That's it. Now let's implement update and delete. For that, I will copy this function from here and let's paste that below. This is for update operation. Update. Along with these parameters, we have to pass the ID from component. Instead of create function, we have update function in API. Sorry, here we forgot to pass the data. For update operation, we have to pass both ID and data. And corresponding type will be update. In case of put or update operation, ASP.NET Core returns nothing. So we just need to create an object like this. And we can pass the ID like this. ID is equal to ID and rest of the properties from data. In short, we just need to pass the ID here. Now let's create the action creator for delete. Sorry, here we have problem with defining this function like this because there is already a keyword with the same name delete. So I will just replace the small d with capital D. For delete operation, we have ID and callback function. We don't have to call this format function. And here we will call the delete function from API. Into this function, we will pass the ID. And here corresponding type will be delete. As a payload, we just need to pass the ID. So that's it. Here we have done with action creators. Now let's update the corresponding reducer. First of all, we have the create operation. So case action types dot create, and here we will return an object. Let's separate existing properties. In case of list, we have to insert a new value. So I will do this. We will separate existing elements inside the array. And then we just need to add the new object from payload. Now let me copy this and pasting for remaining operations. Now we have update operation. For update operation, we have to do something different. State.list is the array, and we will call the map function. Inside that, we have this callback function with X. If there is an element with ID, which is equal to action.payload.id, we have to return the updated object from action payload. Otherwise, we will return as it is. So this is for update operation. Now let's do the delete operation. Delete. Here we can do this. State.list.filter function can be called. And here is the filter condition X, such that we will filter every records if its ID does not match with the ID that we have just deleted. So action.payload contains the deleted ID. So that's it. In this way, we can implement insert, update, and delete operation with React and Redux. Now let's access these action creators. First of all, let's try to insert the record. For that, we have to use this function create. So first of all, we have to map those actions and properties like we have done inside this list component here. So let me copy this import statement for connect, and then I will just paste that here. Now let me copy these two mappings. I will paste that here inside form component. We have to keep this as it is. Now inside this action mapping, we don't need this fetch action creator. Instead, we need create dCandidate. Corresponding action creator is create. Sorry, we forgot to import the actions. So let me copy that import also. And let's paste that here. Now let's map update action. Update dCandidate. Okay, let me update that here. Actions update. We'll be doing both insert and update operation inside this form component, and delete operation will be done inside this list component here. Now let's invoke the connect function here. Connect Into that we'll pass the map state to props and then action to props. Sorry, this is for map state to props. Then let's pass this inside another bracket. Now inside the submit event, let's insert the record. Props dot create the candidate can be called. Into that we can pass the values. As a second parameter we will pass a callback function. So it would be something like this. It would be an alert message. So window dot alert inserted. Let me save this. Back to the app. Now let's populate this form. Now let's submit the form. Boom, that's it. We have inserted this record successfully. Newly inserted record can be seen here. Now let's check that inside the DB whether it is inserted or not. Let's execute this select statement again. So here is the corresponding record. Now let's look how to edit a record. For that, inside this table we will be adding an extra column with buttons for edit and delete. We will implement delete after update operation. Inside this dCandidates component, inside table head we will have an empty header, and inside the body we can have the button table cell. So here we have button. For these two edit and delete operation, I'll be using this button here, button group. So let me add that here, button group, and here we have to set the variant property as text. Inside that we will have one button for each operations. First of all, we will have the edit operation. For that I will be using an icon. We have installed the corresponding package material UI /icons. So let's import the icons here. Import from material UI /icons /edit. We have to import edit icon. Now let's add the import statement for delete icon also. Let me copy this and pasting below that. We have to import delete icon from icons /delete. Now let's add the corresponding icon. I will set the color here primary. So that's it. Now let me copy this and pasting for delete operation. We have delete icon, color will be secondary. So here we have the buttons. Now when we click on this pencil icon, we have to populate corresponding record details inside this form. But this is inside the parent component dCandidates, and this is inside the child component form component. So we have to pass the corresponding record ID into this child component here. For that, I will define a state property inside dCandidates. I will define it like this: constant current ID and corresponding set function. And now let's call the useState function with 0 value. Initially its value will be 0. Now we have to pass this property and its set function to the child component form. That we can do here. We will pass that inside this bracket and we will separate that using this operator. So first of all, we have current ID. Current ID is equal to current ID. In short, you can pass current ID here and set current ID. Now when user click on this icon here, we have to update the corresponding ID into this state property current ID. So I will add the click event for this button here. On click here, I will just call the function inside another function like this. Since we have a parameter for that function, we have to call that inside another callback function. So set current ID, and we can retrieve the corresponding record ID from this callback function parameter record. So record.id. When we click on this edit icon, this ID parameter will be set to current ID property, and we can access that inside this form component using this props property. So whenever there is a change inside this current ID value, we have to populate corresponding record details inside this form here. For that, we can make use of useFX function. use fx. First of all, we will have a callback function like this. Okay, we will call this callback function when there is a change inside current ID. So props dot current ID. Now inside this callback function, in order to populate corresponding record values inside the form, we just need to update this object values. So first of all, we will check whether this ID is 0 or not. We don't have to update the form if it is 0. If it is not equal to 0, we will update the values object. Set values function can be called. Inside that, we can have this object. Now here we have to pass the corresponding object that we can retrieve from this list, the candidates from Redux list. Props the candidate list. From that, we can call this find function x such that x.id is equal to props.current ID. Finally, let's separate the objects here. Now back to the app. Sorry, we forgot to import use effect. Use effect, save, back to the app. Now let's try this edit icon. Boo. We have populated corresponding record details inside the form. After making required changes, we will submit this form. So we have to handle both update and insert operation inside the same form submit event. We can identify whether we have an insert or update operation with the value current ID. Okay, so I will do that here. If props dot current ID if is equal to 0, then we will go for insert operation, else we will do the update operation. So props dot update the candidate. As a first parameter, we have to pass the current ID, props dot current ID, values from the form, and then a success function. So let me copy this same function. Alert message will be something updated. Now back to the app. Let's try to update a record. For now, I will just append asterisk to every field so that we can identify whether all of the fields updated successfully. Let me change this blood group. Age will be something 20. Address. Submit the record. Boo. So here we have done with update operation. You can see the same exact changes inside this list. So during any operations like insert, update or delete, inside the reducer we will update this list. When there is a change inside this list Redux property, all of the components which depend on that list will be re-rendered. So that is how this list is refreshed after any of these operations automatically. Now let's reset this form here. Reset is common to every form components. So I will add that inside use form. Reset form, a function without any parameter. First of all, we will reset the values. So we can call this set values function, and inside that we have to pass an object with empty values which we can retrieve from this initial values. So let me copy that from here. Now let's add the separator. Now let's clear all the errors, set errors, and we'll pass an empty object. We have to do the same operation inside this form component use effects here. This will be invoked whenever we change current ID. In that case also we have to reset the errors. Okay. Inside this function we also have to update the current ID from this parent component. So we can pass that to this use form function here, props current ID. You can do this if you are following this same pattern for all of the components or entities. Now let's update the parameter list here. Sorry, instead of current ID we have to pass corresponding function set current ID. Now let's update the parameter list here, set current ID. Now let's call that function here, set current ID, and we will pass the 0 here. That's it. We have done with reset operation. Now let's export this function here, reset form. Now let's access that inside this form component, reset form. We can call this reset function inside this button click event. Now let's add the on click event. On click is equal to, we will call this function reset form. Now let's try the reset operation here. Yeah, here we have another problem with individual control validation. See, here we have done individual validation for this control, and here we have the error message. When we try to populate another control, previous message is cleared. So it should be inside this function validate. So here is the problem. We have initialized this temp with an empty object. Instead of that, we have to do this. We will initialize that with errors, and following lines will update the errors. Let me save that, back to the app, enter some invalid email, move to the next element, submit the record. Validation is working as expected. Now let's reset the form. Now let's call the reset function after insert or update operation here. Reset form. After insert or update operation, instead of this alert message here, we have to show a notification or toast message. For that, we will install an npm package, npm i4 install, then save React toast notifications. Hit enter. We have successfully installed the package. In order to use this package inside this application, first of all, we have to add a provider for this toast inside this app component. So first of all, let me import that here from React toast notifications. We need to import toast provider. Now let's enclose this container with the provider. So I will use the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+P, wrap with abbreviation, hit enter. So here is the provider, toast provider, hit enter. In order to dismiss toast messages automatically, I will set this attribute auto dismiss as true. Now inside this component we can do this. So first of all, inside the component here, we have to import a class use toasts, React toast notifications, and let's import use toast function here. And inside this component we have to do this. This is for toast message. Add toast can be retrieved while calling this function use toasts. Now inside this submit event, I will define a function like this. Constant on success is equal to, here we just need to call the function add toast. As a first parameter, we can pass the message submitted successfully. As a second parameter, we can define the appearance inside an object like this. Appearance is equal to success. Now let's pass this on success function for insert and update operation. On success. Sorry, I removed the values from here. Now it is better to call this function inside this callback function here, since we have asynchronous HTTP requests inside these function calls. So we can do this. We'll move this function call into this function here. That's it. Now let's do the update operation once again to check the appearance of this toast message. I will update this to its previous values. So here is the toast message, and here we have reset the form. Now let's implement the delete operation inside this list component here. I will add the on click event, on click. So the function will be something like this. We will call the function on delete. Now let's pass the corresponding record ID, record.id. Constant on delete. We have a single parameter, and here is the function. First of all, I want to confirm this operation because delete is a loss of data. So we can do this window.confirm function can be called, and we can ask this, are you sure to delete this record? If user confirm the operation, we can do the delete operation here. In order to delete a record, we have to call this action creator delete. First of all, we have to map that into this component here. Delete dCandidate is equal to actions.delete. Now let's call the function here, props.delete dCandidate. Into that we have to pass this ID. Now after this delete operation also we have to make toast message. Let me copy the same code from here and let's paste that here. Deleted successfully. I will change this appearance to info. Now let's add the corresponding import statement at the top. I will copy that from this form component. Let me copy these two lines also. And let's paste that here. Now back to the app. Now let's delete this first record. Confirm the operation. Boom, that's it. We have deleted corresponding record. So that's it guys. Here we have the complete React.js CRUD operations with ASP.NET Core Web API and SQL Server. For more awesome videos like this, please be subscribed to this channel CodAffection. Please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.